Okay, welcome back to Scar Stories. My name is Nicole Golden. I'm the host, and I am very excited. I say this every week, but I have some pretty awesome friends. We are joined by my friend Megan Richardson. She is a counselor, and I'm going to let her, because I don't even fully know all of her licensing and everything. So I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about how she's licensed, how long she's been in the business. And to Megan, with that, would you tell them why you walked into this field? Because counseling, social work, all of these things, this is a heavy field. My niece just graduated with her social work degree, and she's been working in the field for the past couple of months, and it is heavy. So just your licensing, how many years you've been in, and then why you decided to go this direction.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so
Absolutely
grateful for this opportunity to chat with you, and have so enjoyed watching Scar Stories so far, and look forward to seeing the future ones that you offer. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. There's a lot of kinds of us in terms of mental health. Like you said, there's like licensed clinical social worker, there's like licensed mental health professional, licensed psychologist. And so I went into I got my license in marriage and family because of my desire to really focus on the family system, and really seeing that being a way to offer health to the community is by focusing on marital relationships and how that then affects kids and those kinds of things. So I've been in the business for about 10 years now, I would say.
Love that.
Right after grad school, I moved to the Philippines to work for an NGO that helped both rescue and support survivors of human trafficking over there.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, so a lot of my earlier years were in a lot more trauma focused work.
Yeah.
So when I came back, I then worked with a domestic violence shelter as an advocate for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and have kind of moved around too in terms of, I've worked at a college counseling center, and more recently I've been in private practice. But what I found is a lot of my discussions with people, kind of regardless of the life space, has been around healthy relationships, kind of with self, with others, and that's been a theme. So that's really in my transition to where I'm at now as a mainly couples therapist. That's where a lot of my referrals come for.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting that you said so much of what you're dealing with are relationships and with other people and with self. And that's something I've really been kind of exploring even on my own journey, because, and we've got a wide audience that listens to this. We've got people who follow Jesus, people who don't follow Jesus. But for those of us who have grown up in communities that claim to follow Jesus, one of the things that we're always told is deny yourself, deny yourself, deny yourself, everybody else's needs comes ahead of your own. And as you look at scripture, that's so unbiblical, because when you look at the two greatest commandments, it's love God and love others. But there's a caveat that Jesus adds, that is love others as you love yourself. And if you aren't loving yourself well, you aren't loving others well. But I think in this entitlement culture that we have, we misunderstand what it means to love ourselves. And it doesn't mean love yourself to the detriment of yourself, like self-medicating and all those things. It means loving yourself to a healthy place so that you can love others in health. So I love that. And gosh, yeah, we need so much of that. Now you said, and this is something I actually don't know, and I've always wondered. So you said you refer to yourself as a therapist. So is there a difference between therapy and counseling? Or are they the same thing? It's like tomato.
It's kind of a both and. So in some ways, yes, they're one and the same. I've had some clients who say I much prefer to say I'm going to see a counselor versus a therapist. Therapy for some reason can sound kind of like voodoo a little bit. People. Sometimes it's within professional identity of a therapist. Also, I think that, and in some ways, so my degree is in couples and family counseling. My license is as a marriage and family therapist. So, okay. In that sense, it can be a little bit one and the same. I think sometimes counseling can be a little bit more broad. You can go to a nutrition counselor, you can go to a financial counselor, even a camp counselor, so counseling can kind of be used a little bit more broadly, even outside of mental health. But also there's been times where I've said I'm a therapist and someone has been like, oh, are you a massage therapist or a physical, a physical therapist? I'm like, oh no, I have to clarify that too. So
that's hilarious.
Technically, I think sometimes counseling can be seen as maybe a little bit more directive, kind of with some more practical or pragmatic, like it could be a little bit more advice giving maybe.
Yeah.
Therapy can maybe be a little bit more introspective. So
Yes.
a lot of times therapists will kind of go in and out between, if you really want to know the difference between like counseling and therapy. So sometimes it's appropriate to be a little bit more directive. But sometimes a therapist really trusts that you need to kind of come to some of those things on your own, and that there's a lot of benefit to that too. So it can be important to meet with someone that you trust to know that when they aren't kind of giving you the direct answers or, that help in that sense, that the process is really a lot more important than the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's so true. And that's something like, another conversation that I often have with people is like, how much is counseling going to cost? I don't think I can afford it, and then the whole, should counseling and therapy, I even see it on social media. I follow a lot of mental health hashtags and people, and it's like, mental health needs to be free and therapy and counseling needs to be free. And I go back and forth on that a little bit. And this kind of goes into what you said, like kind of coming to your own conclusions, because for us, and Dave Ramsey would not probably approve of this, but when my world was falling apart our first year of marriage, we went into debt paying for counseling and for therapy. And we shoveled out thousands of dollars because I needed help. And I will tell you, there were a couple of sessions. So in the beginning, I was going to see Kevin twice a week. And there were a couple of times where I would go in and not say a word. I would just sit there because I was so angry, not at him, but and I couldn't even find the words. But in the back of my mind, it's like, but I was also being stubborn, and so in the back of my mind, I'm like, I'm wasting money here, and so it kind of lit a fire under my butt to like engage in the process and not just sit back and be like, fix me, Kevin, like make me better. I had to engage in the process. So, I don't know. How do you feel about that conversation? I'm just kind of throwing this at you out of nowhere, but what are your thoughts on like, should people have to pay? Should they not? I land on, I think we need to invest. Like, I think we need to kind of put our money where our mouth is, literally. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you tend to put your money towards what is most important, right? You find the money for the things that are really important for you. And so even research would kind of be supportive that at least putting something that's of your own of value towards counseling or therapy helps with the process itself. That doesn't always mean, spending a ton. There are therapists that are willing to work on like a sliding scale fee basis. And even with sliding scale or like with insurance, like there's some benefit to someone paying just like $5 a session or something like that. There's some sort of offering of value to the service because of the buy-in that kind of offers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I certainly believe that giving up of something for the process for yourself, it's an investment in self that is absolutely worth it.
Yeah. And I do think like making it affordable, and that was something even in the beginning, like Kevin and I worked out something to make it affordable. I was just going so much, but yeah, making it affordable.
Sometimes that's necessary, right?
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
Not forever,
Exactly.
But sometimes it's really important for that increase, in seeing somebody so that you can get to a point where you can extend that time between sessions too.
Well, and I think that's something else too that I want to talk to you about, because so there's several questions I want to get to. So I'm like, do I throw them all out at once, or how do we do it? But so one of the other questions that people ask me a lot, see, I'm an extrovert by nature. So like going and talking to somebody is no big deal for me. And also like, I don't care if everybody knows me and my story. Like I'm not a very private individual. I process by talking it out and learning from other people. So that's not an issue for me. But there are some other people who have gone through some really dark trauma, first of all. And it's like reliving through that trauma scares them to death. And in their minds, when they get into therapy or into counseling, they are going to have to relive it because they're going to have to explain what happened and how it happened. And so I think, honestly, that keeps a lot of people from going to therapy. And so what words of encouragement, a lot of times what I'll tell them is like, just get in there and explain that to your therapist, get in there and explain that to your counselor and let them guide you through it. But like, what does that process look like for people who, they're going to have to walk through even some military, you live in the Tampa Bay area like I do. And so we're close to MacDill Air Force Base. So I'm sure you see a lot of, you can't say yes or no, obviously, but I'm sure you do see a lot of military people. So even like the PTSD, all of that stuff, how do you guide them through the trauma? So it's not like they're going to have another emotional breakdown in your office, or is that something they just have to do? Is that part of the healing?
Yeah, I think again, that's part of the both and of the process. What you're describing is absolutely something that I hear from my clients where, I thought I want to start counseling, but there's this fear of like, what if I open up the can of worms and then it can't be contained, right? Like I've worked my whole life to try to shove it down, keep it inside, and it does creep out, and it's affecting this, it's affecting that, but I feel like so far I'm in control.
Yes.
And so the idea of releasing that can feel really scary and chaotic and out of your control, right?
Yeah.
And so, what I talk about with clients who might be scared about that is one, making sure that you do see someone that's trauma informed. So seeing a therapist that is used to working with trauma, where knowing that, the way I do it is I share with clients, we're going to work at your pace. The expectation isn't going to be that you come and you share all of your deepest, darkest secrets with all of the details before you're ready for that, because that wouldn't be helpful to you, right? And so part of the therapeutic process is sharing those stories at a pace that's comfortable, but also knowing that there's a way to keep it contained through, making sure that we learn skills to cope, to manage strong emotions. Because certainly as a therapist, I do think it's beneficial to talk about those big emotions and to share those stories. A lot of feelings we have stories.
Oh, I love that. I have to write that down. Feelings we have stories. I'm gonna write that down. I'll quote I learned so much in these things. Like I always have like stuff to write down, and I'm like, okay, feelings we have stories. That was gold. And I love that you said like work at their own pace, because what's so funny is, so I've been in counseling therapy. I don't even know if that's Kevin what he refers to himself as. I don't even know. But for 10 years now, over 10 years. And it's funny because there'll still be things that creep up that I'm like, oh, I've never, like I'll be in conversation with Bryant and I'll share something from my past. And he's like, you've never shared that before. And I'm like, oh, I guess I haven't, like I'm still kind of working through, still kind of organizing, still processing. And in a way, I think our brains, and I would go a step further because I'm a Jesus follower, as I know you are, but I would say, I think God helps us, even like he gives us what we can handle each season. So we're not overwhelmed and taken out by all of it at once, But I love how you said, like, you let them work at their pace. I love that.
One of the best ways that I've heard it kind of described is almost like a puzzle, where you have all the pieces laid out on the table. And like, at first that can feel really overwhelming. Like, oh my gosh, how am I going to put together this 1,000-piece puzzle? And so, almost by sharing those stories bit by bit, like 2 pieces might fit together in this session, a few pieces might fit together here, so that the picture kind of starts to be formed a little bit. And, that's where our brain really, it helps to talk about things, even for, I know you mentioned I'm an extrovert, but sometimes people are introvert. They don't know why maybe talking about things could help. It helps to kind of put some of the puzzle pieces together to make meaning, potentially create purpose for pain and things that have been very difficult to live through and manage.
I've got to write that down too. Create purpose for pain. That's good. Create purpose. Sorry. It's so good. I love interviewing. You're the second licensed like therapist / counselor I've interviewed. And so even like with Kevin, I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm kind of in counseling myself. So I think, and I had a question and I just got distracted by that, by writing down that really good line.
Well, I think I want to speak to one more thing in terms of
do it.
That you just had too, because I think with introverts too, a lot of times they'll think like, what am I going to say? And how do I know what to say? Because it seemed like that's also what you were asking too.
Yes.
And so, one of the things I say to my clients a lot is like, you can trust that if, you're coming to counseling, but you don't quite know what you're going to share, that like, I'm trained to kind of guide the conversation around, goals. And a lot of times people, even if they come with a plan, counseling can go so many different ways. And so there's, I know one therapist that says like all roads lead to Rome, right? And so you don't always know the direction that it's going to go. It really requires kind of a trust of the process. But
I love that, because like that was I had another friend that told me, she was like, part of the reason that I've stayed out of counseling is not because I'm afraid of it. She's like, I believe I need to get into it, but I don't know. She's like, I just don't even know what's going on with me. So when I get in there, I don't know even what I'm going to say. And I had somebody else that same thing was like, but in her case, she knew what she needed to deal with, but she was like, how do we start? Do I just go in and sit down and like, hi, my name is so-and-so, nice to meet you, Megan, blah, So how do sessions like that first session, how does that usually go for someone? Just so maybe people can come in having a little bit more of a feeling of like familiarity. So if they do it, it's not like they're walking into a dark room and have no idea what's going on.
I think a lot of times clients might almost see like that first session as like a confessional. Like I have to like come to therapy and like confess all my sins and see how my therapist reacts and what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong and those kinds of things, where it's not that at all. Most therapists have a pretty structured first appointment that is different from what future sessions would look like.
Yeah.
But that first session is very structured. Typically, we ask the same questions of everybody, kind of that first session. And really the goal of that is to get the general picture of, what you've survived so far in your life, what's your life story, family history. Some of the questions will feel relevant to what your experience has been. Some questions will feel really out there and not at all related to you. And so I think that structure in a lot of ways can help, so that the therapist then can gather a good amount of information. And then, usually at the end, there's some time to do some goal setting to, really ask, like, what do you hope to get out of this process? What is important for you? And then the therapist can share like, well, this is where I can see my role in being a part of, making some movement towards these goals. So I think that first session having some structure can help to alleviate some of the stress or anxiety of like, well, what am I going to say? And what is this going to look like?
I think it's so funny because that's one thing I tell people all the time. It's like, these people went to school for this stuff. Like, you just need to bring yourself and your issues and then let them lead. Like, they will take control. And they will walk you through it. One of the things too that I hear a lot of people is like, how do I even find a counselor? Because I do think like that's a big deal. And it's funny, like my story in finding Kevin was just random. I was meeting with some people I'd known for the longest time. And see, I grew up in environments where like counseling was like voodoo. Like it was like, this is a waste of time. This is a quack job. Like it's not needed, the whole 9 yards. No offense. You know how I feel about counseling now. I feel like if we didn't have counselors, where would we be? But so I was meeting with some people and they just randomly were like, hey, here's some CDs. This guy, Dr. Kevin Hull, did some seminars at our church. Listen to these, they may help you. And so I started listening to them and I just was not making traction. Things were just getting worse. So I was kind of like at a last resort. So I was like, I'm just going to call him and make an appointment and see what happens. And now 10 years later, here we are. So for me, I was so desperate. I didn't care. And I had already listened to some things he had done and had realized like, dude, this guy's on point and this is exactly what I'm walking through. And so I knew that we were going to be successful. But I will say, so there's a couple of questions. I think there's like 2 questions. For me in the beginning, counseling was always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So it was like we would make progress, then I would digress, but not so far that we'd have to start over. And then we'd move forward again, and then I would digress. And so in the beginning, it was a lot of what I said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I guess the first question is how do people go about finding a counselor? And I think like you mentioned, specifically, like if you have walked through, trauma, and I'll say trigger warning here, if you've, experienced PTSD, if you've experienced rape or abuse or anything like that, like finding a counselor that specializes in that is important, specializing. But how do people go about finding a counselor? And then the second part of that question is, should they feel discouraged that in the beginning, it is kind of a dating thing where you're getting to know the counselor, building that trust. And it's not always going to be like, oh, I'm making all this progress at first. Or should they, like, I've made a bunch of progress, now I'm falling back, but now I'm going to quit because it's not working. That's something, it's not working. I've heard so many people tell me it's not working. So how do they find a counselor? And then is it normal for it to feel like it's not working?
Yeah. So, I mean, one, it is really hard to find a counselor. And I think part of that is, it's almost kind of like churches too. There's so many that like, who can you trust, And so it is an investment too, to go to that first session, and essentially in that first session, it does require some trust, right? I'm going to go sit down with a stranger and share a lot. And so, trusting is a really important part of the process, which is probably why it was helpful for you and Dr. Kevin too, because you said, you had listened to some things. He was already someone that, that you can trust. And some of the research even says kind of ironically that the best outcomes in therapy actually happen when a person likes their therapist, kind of beyond like their theoretical orientation or like their education. And so, you know, in a lot of ways, it very much is a chemistry thing that, you know, you finding someone that you feel comfortable with, that you can trust, where, you know, at some point when maybe they do need to confront you on some uncomfortable things, that you would be able to experience that kind of with compassion and with support, and to be able to receive some of that. And I think what's hard is when you do start to go and it doesn't feel like a good fit, because there's been an investment of time, an investment of money, it's hard to shift and to maybe try somebody else. But to know that that's okay, you know, not every therapist is the best fit for everybody. I'm not the best fit for everybody. And so to know that you can kind of trust your gut in that a little bit. I think you can learn a lot from even just initial phone calls and like the feeling you get from talking with someone on the phone, or even from that first session. But I mean, in terms of finding someone too, if you feel comfortable, maybe ask some friends who, if they see somebody that they know and trust, I think word of mouth can be really helpful. If you have a friend who's a therapist, it doesn't mean you should go to them. So I've had a lot of friends who've like secretly gone to therapists and been like, I went and I'm so sorry. And I'm like, I wouldn't have like wanted you to see me. I couldn't see you as a therapist. You're my friend, you know? So, but therapists can also be great referral sources. So, you know, if you call someone and maybe they specialize in something different, to maybe ask them, well, do you know anyone who specializes in this? And maybe have some expertise in that.
And I think a lot of times too, even if you are Googling or searching, you can read bios, you can read people's like thoughts of them. And like what you said, a lot of therapists and counselors will allow you to have a free 15-minute phone conversation just to even see if you connect in the beginning. But I love the idea of like referrals. I tell a lot of people that, like, you know, I'm surely somebody, you know, is seeing a counselor, you know, or some therapist or knows of people. And so we do a lot of referrals at the church. I refer people to either Kevin's office or to you. Those are because I trust, I've seen what you've been able to do, you know, with people. I mean, that seems like weird, like I've infringed, but people who have shared with me that they've seen you, not that I've like gone into your office. And because that's another thing that I think people don't realize is like you guys legally are, you sign all sorts of forms where you are not able to share anything. So even like as a church perspective, like I think that's something a lot of people get worried about. And we've been asked is like, well, if you're referring us to someone, are they going to tell you? Like, no, legally, if they do that, their practice is over.
The only way release of information, or unless you want me to, or things like that.
They can sign release forms, but that's only under your permission with your signature. So okay, so what about the question of people who like they start to take step forwards and then they regress and they're like it's not working, they quit? Like, is that a normal experience in counseling?
You know, I try to name that kind of ahead of time as I'm working with clients. So I think a lot of times when people think about a therapeutic process and they start to feel better, they almost see it as like this like uphill, like I'm just going to keep getting better. I drew a graph, you know, I would just show it like kind of being a straight forward up, where a lot of times counseling is just like so much like all over the place. But it also doesn't mean that progress isn't being made. So a lot of times if someone is coming, you know, to talk about depression and they've had some good days and now are feeling depressed again, might say like, oh, all is lost, this isn't working, where, you know, I might kind of challenge that and say like, well, if you've been able to experience some positive days, like sometimes it's not about ending the depression completely at first, but how do we extend more and more time where you're able to feel, you know, not feel that way. So I'm not ever surprised to see kind of the one step back, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That is a part of the process, and that's a part of growth. And it's easy to go back to what feels normal, right? Like sometimes even if that's not best, that's what's most comfortable. And so, you know, it's not to, you know, a lot of times, again, clients will come on and think that like they've done something wrong. I'm like, it's not shameful. Like you're a human, right? Like that's a normal thing to do as you're trying to create change in your life.
You've not failed. I oftentimes think about like, you know, when I first started going to counseling, I was 26, I think, or 25, somewhere around there. And like, it took me 25 years to get to that point. So to think that like a couple sessions, I'm going to be able to rewire 25 years of wiring and, you know what I'm saying? To like totally be able to handle 25 years of triggers. Like that's silly when you think about it that way. And then also, exactly. Cause like your brain does wire itself a certain way to keep you alive in certain situations. And so, and I think the other thing is like, we live in a broken world. And it's something I've talked to a lot of people about on Scar Stories is like this side of heaven. I'm one of those people. I do think in some rare cases, God can completely remove anxiety or God can completely remove depression, but I don't always feel like that's the case. And I think sometimes we make big promises by being like, oh, you're going to be completely anxiety and depression free and whatever. Like, I think this side of heaven, that's a really big promise to make. And so just getting comfortable in the fact of like, yeah, we're going to have some good days, but then we're going to have some bad days, and embracing those bad days because they make the good days really good, and just learning how to, like you said, put more good days back to back than bad days. So I wanted to see.
That reminds me too, Nicole, also,
Yeah.
I mean, as you're sharing that, I think a lot of times, with the life stories that we have so far, we do develop kind of certain coping skills to survive that in a lot of ways have been helpful to us. And so a lot of times when people come to therapy, it's to the point where like the coping skills that used to work, and maybe that's avoidance, maybe it's things that aren't necessarily considered healthy now or like aren't working now. It doesn't mean that they were wrong or bad then. These things that we have used helped us to survive. So it's not something to see as like wrong, just like it's something that's not working anymore. And I need to create some new kind of brain patterns so that I can learn to kind of shift and see this in a different way. And that's something I found myself thinking about as you were sharing.
I love that, because that's so funny. Because I was talking to somebody else about that, and it's like our culture likes to categorize things as good or bad because then it's easy for us to wrap our minds around that. But then we carry so much shame and guilt around that. So I love that. Like, you're exactly right. Some of us needed those coping skills to make it through. And honestly, that's something Kevin I'll talk about every once in a while too. He's like, I'm proud of you. Look at where you've gotten to. I remember one point he was like, the fact that you have a job and you are in a healthy relationship is a miracle, because you should be on the side of the road homeless somewhere with like all the things you've had to work through, and I was like, dang, okay. So I love that. I love that perspective.
Yes, being able to celebrate strengths and kind of, resiliency. It's a really important part of the process too, in terms of like what you've been able to overcome. And I think a lot of times that's where people might also be scared to share about their trauma, because maybe there's a feeling of like, does that make me weak, or do I look weak? Where, a therapist will see that as strength, actually, where, where you're in your weakest moments is really when you have to exhibit the most strength. And there's a lot of privilege for therapists, to be able to like bear witness to that pain, to like see that pain and to walk through that with somebody, because it's powerful. And so to be able to shift that perspective to where the client can then see that as power, is really incredible to be a part of.
Dang, come on, girl, preach. That's awesome. I love that. I love that. Okay, so I think the last question, because I know you've got to actually get to some sessions here. The last question is, a lot of times people will ask about meds, and can counselors or therapists prescribe medication? And as far as I understand, you cannot, but that's when you would bring a psychiatrist into the picture. And psychiatrist is such a big, like, stigmatized, like, I don't know, before I got into all this, when I think of psychiatrists, I think of psych ward, and then I think of people in the bodysuits and everything else. So talk to us a little bit about meds, talk to us a little bit about psychiatrists and what psychiatrists, because you actually were one of the first people to actually explain to me, you probably don't even know this, but what psychiatrists do and the point of a psychiatrist. So can you talk to us a little bit about psychiatrists?
Yeah, and it can be confusing, because I think like the name itself is like similar to psychologist. So when people come to me, they're like, what are you and who are you and what do you do, So so psychiatry, it can be a really important part of the therapeutic process. Psychiatrists are doctors that prescribe medication. And so usually their appointments are much quicker than therapy, maybe around like 15 minutes or so. And the issue around medication can be pretty controversial. A lot of people have really strong feelings around whether or not to do it, being for or against it, or those kinds of things. But in a lot of situations, medication can be life-saving for people.
Yes.
Especially if it's medication that needs to be taken in the long term. So obviously sometimes medication is appropriate in terms of a life season or kind of an environmental shift that's happening, and it doesn't always have to be for forever. But for some people, it's critical to survival. I kind of like to describe it, for some people who've taken medication for the first time, we'll kind of describe it or compare it to like putting glasses on for the first time when you really need it. And being able to see details that like before you're like, oh, this is what it's supposed to look like. Like I didn't even know like I could feel this way, or that it's supposed to be this way. And so it can be really helpful, and it can be really discouraging when people that you love and trust around you are discouraging of that when it's something that you feel like you really need. So I would say that if some, like a provider that you're working with that you really trust is recommending it, that it is worth a trial. You know, medication is always something that you can take yourself off of, but in some ways you owe it to yourself to see what it might be like to put your glasses on, you know, and what it can feel like.
I love that. So,
and it's not for every client too that I, you know, that everyone goes to see a psychiatrist, but there are times where it can be very important.
And most counselors or therapists will have psychiatrists that they will recommend, that they work personally, you know, that they know or they've sent clients to before. And the reason why I think psychiatry is so important is because, you know, I've had several people like, I've tried all different medications and they've made me wacko, or they've made me sleepy, or they've made me gain a ton of weight. And so psychiatrists know the medication, and they can also, like, when you come in and give symptoms or this is what I'm feeling, because that's basically all they work with, they can help you get on the right med for you. And so I think that's why a lot of times it's so important to work with psychiatrists and not just a medical doctor. Medical doctors, you know, your family physician may not have the knowledge that a psychiatrist would have. And so that was one thing you had taught me. I think for me, so I wasn't on any medication until I had Ryder, which is my first boy. And for whatever reason, it's funny, I've talked to a lot of moms when they've had boys, it has whacked them out emotionally. I don't know if it's the extra testosterone, whatever that word is, testosterone. Am I saying that right? Whatever. Anyways, I'm watching my mom. But so, and then I've kind of been on and off it depending on the season. And it's funny because even just a couple of weeks ago, I was like, I think I might get off. And so I talked to Kevin about it, tried to get off for a little bit, and I was just struggling. Mm-hmm. And so I called Kevin and we did a FaceTime, and I was just like, my biggest thing is always, I don't want the medication to be a crutch. I don't want to get to where I feel good, so good that I'm not dealing with why I was feeling bad in the first place, you know? Mm-hmm. I guess not feeling bad, but like the anxiety or depression. And so he was like, it's not a crutch. He's like, when we are walking, I use SSRIs. I'm on Lexapro. And he was like, when we're walking through intense, stressful seasons, your serotonin levels decrease. And so SSRIs help increase those serotonin levels so that, what you said, you put those glasses on, you can think clearly. And sometimes it'll carry you through the times in counseling where you're dealing with really traumatic experiences, or when you just need a little bit of extra help to process through situations. So
yeah, it gives you some space. It can give you some room, you know, to be able to talk about those things. And you know, whenever anyone is seeing a psychiatrist, I always would recommend being in therapy so that there is someone you can go to talk to say like, hey, I'm feeling this way. Is this off? You know, to where then your therapist will be like, well, tell your therapist or your psychiatrist that, and, you know, make sure that you're including them in that. Because even with a psychiatrist, there's a level of trial and error in terms of, okay, this isn't working for you. Let's try this and kind of move it around this way. And so with psychiatry too, it might not always work immediately. Like sometimes there is some time that it takes to find like the right dosage for each person too.
And you know how good Americans are, especially with things that aren't immediate, right? We're ridiculous. Like, it's not working, I quit, you know, like, oh my gosh. Anyways, thank you so much for your time, Megan. I really appreciate it. This has been super helpful for me, and I know it's going to be so helpful for other people. So drop comments. We love to read them. I'll get them back to Megan. But thank you guys so much for joining us for Scar Stories. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.